Hey everyone, before we begin, I have two housekeeping items to share. All participants are muted as a default of the Zoom webinar. However, we invite you to submit questions via the Q&A chat box that you see on the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session with the panelists. So welcome everyone to the YPL Leadership Webinar Series. We have a very special presentation prepared for you today. But first, I want to thank MTS Physical Therapy and Wellness for their generous sponsorship. I can personally attest to their service because I've been treated for multiple ailments by their team. I love these guys because they don't just treat the symptoms, they go for the root of the problem. They have a huge portfolio of services in multiple locations in Lafayette, Breaux Bridge, and Youngsville. So check out their website, that's mtsphysicaltherapy.com. Now for our presenter. Chris Comeaux has spent his life and career researching, learning, coaching, and implementing the pushes and pulls necessary to create high-performance leaders and high-performance organizations. He is currently the president and CEO of Teleos Collaborative Network, which is a collaboration between multiple hospices around the country, which include a few locals, which is the Hospice of Acadiana and the Hospice of Baton Rouge. Chris has a master's in leadership from the Thayer Institute for Performance Virtuosity and is a native of Opelousas, but now resides in Western North Carolina. Chris, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. You have the floor.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin, and good afternoon to everybody. Let's get the slides up. Justin, give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide. Good deal. Well, I got to tell you guys, this is a really big deal for me. I've gotten to present throughout my life, literally all over the world, but there's something about presenting back to your hometown, home folks. It's just a different deal. In fact, I'll tell you guys a quick funny. Appreciate Fumi gave me an opportunity to do a quick kind of a PSA for today, which apparently aired on PASPA 2. And I've been on a lot of TV stations throughout my entire career, but I've never been on PASPA 2 before. And I forgot to give my parents a heads up that that was a possibility. So my dad's an early riser, so he's up early in the morning, and all of a sudden there's his son on PASPA 2. So he's texting me, and I'm still sleeping back here on the East Coast, and so he was pretty excited to see his son. But I feel like it's a whole nother level presenting to all the wonderful folks back in Louisiana. My dad he got on me about one thing. He said, "You said you're from Opelousas. You need to tell them you're actually from Lawtell." And I'm like, "Dad, most people don't even know where Lawtell is in Louisiana, but there may be a couple of folks today who know exactly where I'm talking about." So I'm especially excited when Justin asked me and he said, "Look, what would be a relevant topic? I'd love to give you this opportunity to present to this young professionals group we have with LAGCOE." And I told Justin, I said, "I think this is exactly the topic." And so this is one of the go-to tools. You think about if you're a carpenter of some type, you know, a hammer and a tape measure are like your go-to tools. I do coaching all over the country. In fact, Justin kind of shared it in my intro here. Let me get my slides working. So we work with hospices in 5 different states. Hospice is my passion. It's where I grew up. But the reality is leadership is really my shtick and my specialty. I just so happen to be blessed to get to do it in the hospice area. But the leadership principles that we teach, they apply to any organization. And I think Justin would probably give me a thumbs up. In fact, I think we've got a few other folks on this call that we had a wonderful CEO group for a while based there in the Lafayette area and around. And the tools that are in my toolbox apply to any business. But what we're going to talk about today is probably one of the most important tools because it's about how do you get things done. And then in the very beginning of my presentation is going to be how do you get the right things done. And where did all of this idea come from? In fact, I created a visual for you guys today. The wonderful thing about if you ever work with me, I quote a lot of books, but I never do it because you have to go and read them. I try to extract the wisdom from those books and put it together in a comprehensive system so people can apply it. You know, there's a huge industry out there of all the business books, but quite often leaders it feels like flavor of the month. And I've always felt part of my purpose here on earth is to take that wisdom and pay it forward to people so they can practically apply it in their businesses. So what we're going to talk about today is probably one of the most practical application tools. Whoops, didn't mean for that to happen here. There we go. There we go. These are all the hospices we work with, and I did want to give a shout out to the incredible folks at Hospice of Acadiana. They're kind of a test case, and so a lot of leaders at Hospice of Acadiana that are using these tools that I'm going to share with you, the fundamentals of the Getting Things Done system. This is used throughout all of these hospices. We now work with about 11 programs in those 5 different states. So this is not just some theory. This is something that I practice. It's made me very successful in my life, and it's really been developed in one of the toughest industries possible. If you think about the work of what hospices do, walking alongside people at one of the toughest times of their lives and creating this comprehensive, very caring, compassionate care system, it's a pretty tough environment. And so I would say that these tools have been proven in an environment where it's made a huge difference. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're actually going to talk about the fundamentals of a Getting Things Done system. And when I used to present this a couple years ago, there were 5 fundamentals. In fact, I have kind of a standing bet, and I give it to all of you guys. I've done a lot of reading and research. Again, this is kind of the books where all of this wisdom has come from. And I've come to the conclusion that there are these principles or fundamentals that if you're going to have a great organization system, it needs to be based upon these principles. But I have a standing bet that if you find another principle or fundamental, I'll gladly pay you $100. So when I started, it was 5, and now it's actually up to 7. So obviously you could do the math. I've actually paid out $200 to other people because they said, oh, I get it. And have you ever considered this is really a fundamental of a great organization system? Now, I got to tell you as well, where kind of the pain that it was in my life that made me do the research. So in the early days, I loved Stephen Covey, and I used to have my Covey planner wherever I went. The challenge that I found is that I found often that I served my Covey system, and my Covey system didn't serve me. And it was especially clinicians that said, Chris, you know, you teach the Covey process, but I just don't think it works for me as a clinician. And that sent me in research mode because I've always had a theory that I don't care what your position is. If you're in physical therapy, oil and gas, engineering company, an association, wherever you work, you have to have a system of organization. And I've seen some people naturally well organized, and then I've seen some people not organized. And I've seen it affect their ability to be effective, to live their cause and purpose. And so it really got me to do this reading and research. And I said, okay, I've got to teach anyone, no matter what the industry is here's the principles. Now you can go and utilize a tool. So you'll see as we go through this presentation, I'm going to share the fundamentals or the principles with you. And I'll give you a couple of examples of tools that I use to comply with that fundamental. But what I know is these are the fundamentals. And you may find a better tool, and it's great people swap tools. In fact, most kind of time efficiency presentations will say, well, go use OneNote or go use Todoist. Those are great tools, but I'd rather teach you the principle. It's kind of the concept of if I could teach you the principle, then I will teach you to fish for the rest of your life, as opposed to teaching you a tool that who knows, as technology moves, it might be antiquated in another couple of years or even 6 months as quickly as technology moves these days. So there are now 7 fundamentals in the Getting Things Done system, and we're going to go through those together. Now, there's an adage that I love, and Justin will probably smile at this. I use it in almost every presentation I do, and I think that nature has some amazing lessons that it teaches us sometimes, and great leadership lessons and wisdom. But when I heard this adage, I never forgot it. And basically it says this, that an eagle, when it flies, it sees in 2 directions at once. It sees the horizon, and it also looks down at for its food at the same time. That's super cool. And I always thought that's an awesome metaphor for what is really leadership. And you think about it, most of us that are in leadership are usually skilled or maybe gifted on one end of those. Like I've known great visionary leaders, but they're awful at getting stuff done. And I've known great leaders that are awesome at getting stuff done, and they're not very good on the vision thing. And what I found over the course of time is not that you have to be equally perfect at both, but if you don't have tools on both ends of the continuum, you're going to be limited in what you could accomplish in this life. So this system, these fundamentals that are researched, you can plot them because they actually give you tools to look on the horizon. Where are you going? But it also gives you tools to get it done on a day-to-day basis. It's got both in there. And again, there's a great leadership lesson. I could give a whole talk just on the vision of the eagle. Now, a lot of you probably feel like this each day. In fact, Stephen Covey years ago, and actually this was in the early 90s, he would use the analogy that the times that we live are like whitewater rapids. This was in the 90s, guys, the early 90s. Think about the time we live now. That was before social media, smartphones. And so how do you get stuff done when we got all this stuff coming at us? In fact, Covey used to say we live at a time at class 4 rapids. Well, they were class 4 in the early 90s. I guess we're class 6 now. You've got email coming at you, your cell phone, instant messaging, social media, just all of this stuff coming at you. And what I will tell you is this, is if you don't have a system, if you don't have a good organization system, what's going to happen is you're going to be at the whims of the whitewater rapids. And maybe you want to go here in your life, but the whitewater rapids take you in a totally different direction. So if you don't have a system to get things done, you're just going to react to things. And I love the adage that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And you're not going to create it if you don't have a good system to understand where you're trying to go and get it done on a day-to-day basis. Now, this next book, don't go read it, because I will extract exactly what I felt was the wisdom from this book. It was called Crazy Busy, and there's a lot of great language in this book that I think we'd identify with. It talks about being frazzed, coping in a world that's gone ADD, and again, this book was written actually in about 2005, 2006, and just think of where we are now, almost 15 years later. And so people are overbooked, about to snap, just dealing with all of the things coming at us. And the guy, Hollowell, when he wrote this book, he was putting himself through school working on his PhD. And he said he was working like in a Waffle House next to this guy named Bubba, it was just fascinating because Hollowell was learning how does the mind work while he's working next to this short order cook. And he's watching this guy, and he wasn't dissing on blue collar workers, but just saying, I'm kind of getting a PhD and I'm watching this guy multitask and I'm learning how the mind works. And he learned a really cool principle. And so because this guy had been doing it so long, he was taking in orders, like it almost looked like chaos around him where he was receiving orders and as a short order cook, serving them up at the same time. And he was learning about the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And here was part of his conclusion, is that he used this concept that your subconscious mind is almost like the mind's robot. And that when you do things repetitively, it's almost like you've got this built-in automon or automated system that can take over. So your conscious mind could be ready for that which is not normal. And there's a lot of interesting applications if this is true. But my immediate aha was, oh my gosh, this applies to my getting things done system. A lot of people don't have a system, and if they have a system, it hasn't been well thought out, and it's not part of who they are. But if you have a great system based on good fundamentals, and it is so hardwired into who you are on a day-to-day basis, it's like almost like you have a built-in another brain, and things are coming at you, and you're putting it into your system. So your conscious mind could be more present for that which is not normal. In fact, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I'll talk to you about it just for a second. And if any of you have ever gotten a fatal exception error on your computer, quite often when you get that blue screen, it's because you had multiple windows open and you opened up that one more window and your computer blue screened on you. A lot of us don't realize because we don't have a good getting things done system, that's your mind. Your mind is like that computer where you have all these open windows and you wondered why maybe your wife or that one staff person that came in on you and you just kind of maybe blew up on them. And it's almost like you get outside of yourself and you're looking down at yourself and going, why did I do that? Well, it might be because you don't have a good organization system and they hit that tripwire that kind of gave you that fatal exception error. So the premise of this book is, and I do believe it's true because I think I'm a living proof of it, you have a good system based on good fundamentals. And then through practice and repetition, it's so much a part of you, all these things could be coming at you and you go, oh, that goes in my reference system. That goes in my intake system. That goes in my task list. So my mind could be engaged in the creative, the problem solving. In fact, the amazing thing that people tell me that hardwire the system in their life is paradoxically, they get more creative. They come up with a lot more ideas. And I usually tell them, you know why? Because you shut down those windows of your mind and now you're rededicating the RAM of your mind to problem solve, as opposed to what you were doing before, which was remembering all the things that you had to do. How many of you, like at 2 o'clock in the morning, like, oh crap, I can't go to sleep, and I get the little tablet next to the bed and you got to write the stuff out. What you're trying to do is close those windows so you could go to sleep for the night. All right, so all of that is just great pretext to, okay, Comeaux, then what are these fundamentals? And so it's interesting, I actually had 6 fundamentals until I went on vacation last year, and it really occurred to me, and this is the first one I want to talk to you about today, is the 7th fundamental, which is cause and purpose. And I was actually laying on the beach in Pensacola Beach when it really sunk in, this really is a principle, and I would be doing someone a disservice to not actually share with them that cause and purpose is a fundamental of a great organization system. Now, we could do a whole presentation with each other just talking about cause and purpose, but suffice to say, I think if you got a good organization system, you need to spend some time and think about what is your cause and purpose. And personally, I wrote a blog, and actually I gave you the link right here on this slide, and actually wrote a whole series of blogs, by the way, on all the fundamentals, but I actually wrote a 3-part series just on this one fundamental. So I'm going to try to just hit the highlights today. But understanding your cause and purpose is very important in the context of getting things done. Because if you adopted everything else I would be telling you today with the other 6, and you just got exemplary at it, you could be super efficient, but you may not be super efficient living your cause and purpose. You could just be super efficient at getting things done, but you're getting the right things done. And it was just an epiphany on the beach going, oh, I am doing a disservice to people. And frankly, I'll be straight up. It was this book I was actually reading last summer, and it really hit me. And the title of the book is What's Best Next, and it's by Matt Perman. And I thought, you know what, I need to add that to one of the fundamentals. And so not to belabor it too much, but when you think about cause and purpose, personally, I have a written mission statement, a vision statement. I have written what are my roles in life. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm a CEO of a company, I'm in the elders in my church. All of those are different roles that I play. And then my personal values. Now, some of this is not new. Covey was teaching this years ago. But here's a piece of wisdom I don't want you to miss. I find that your cause and purpose, the more that one, you try to take the time to write it down, but it doesn't happen the way we want it to happen. We literally would like the skies to open, the angels to sing, and this tablet to come on down, and there it is. There's your cause and purpose. I find wherever I'm at on my life's journey, writing down what I think my cause and purpose is right now, and then kind of the outline of that is my mission, my vision statement, my roles, and my values. The more that I try to live that, I gain a better and better understanding, and I keep coming back to those tools, and I keep editing them. I keep playing with the words. And the analogy I would give you, if you've ever looked through a telescope when your younger days, or even today maybe with your kids, you know, you've got that telescope and you keep dialing it in, and it gets clearer and clearer and clearer. That's the best way I know how to describe the journey to you of understanding cause and purpose. And there's something magical about writing it down. In fact, I watched the movie with my kids. Some of you probably, it's an old movie called Inkheart, and they would actually write it out in the book and it would come out in real life. I think that's a really cool metaphor for why it's important to write things down. So that's the 7th fundamental. Understanding your cause and purpose and actually writing it down. And I'll show you when I get into the tools that my cause and purpose is documented in one of the tools that I use called OneNote. But it is the 7th fundamental, and you could make the argument it's almost the most important one. Although I find it interesting that it didn't occur to me till later that it was one of the fundamentals. All right, so that's number 7. Now we're going to back up and go to number 1. And so the first fundamental of any good getting things done system to organize yourself is a calendar. Now, some of you are going, really? Come on now, you already knew that, right? Yes, you're right. Most people know that they have a calendar, but not everyone knows how to use a calendar, I found. Think about it this way. What is the most precious, unreplenishable resource that we have in this life? It's time, right? In fact, a lot of you probably have a personal budget at home because you actually take a lot of stock in your financial resources, and you want to make the most out of what financial resources you've been given. That's a budget. Well, guess what? The calendar is like a budget for your time on a day-to-day basis. So for me, my time is budgeted pretty much from the time that I wake up till the time that I go to bed. Now, in certain times of the day, it's more like swaths of time. Like I don't have on my calendar, sit down and talk to my wife at 7 o'clock. But I do have general when I know it's going to be family time in the evening. Because the interesting thing is every one of us get 24 hours in a day. The amazing thing is the most effective people, they seem to just maximize that resource compared to other people like, I just kind of go with the flow throughout the day. So your calendar this is your non-discretionary time. Where do you have to be? You have to be in a meeting, or maybe you need to work on a project. In fact, one of the tips I would give you, I block out time on my calendar to work on projects. That would be tip number one. I actually have on my calendar email. When do I check email? Because you know what happens? If we don't put it on our calendar, guess when we're checking email? Either we don't, or we're actually checking them late at night. And then, we're like living in denial. There's 24 hours in the day. I'm just going to get to it, but I get about 150 emails a day. So actually blocking it. In fact, I'll tell you another thing that I learned. I actually have a placeholder in my calendar during the week called margin. And so, in fact, my good friend Brian may not know this. And so I got in a horrible bike accident and broke my neck actually about 2 years ago. I'm a walking miracle that I can still walk. And I'll never forget, I was in the hospital, and one of my good friends was talking to my wife. They thought I was comatose. And he said, Chris doesn't have any margin in his life. And I was sitting there thinking, he's right, because it's not on my calendar. And so the best way to create margin was to put it on my calendar. I've struggled with working out consistently in my life until the last 2 years. Just put it on your calendar. So literally your calendar basically says where you should spend your time. But I also fully realize for some of you that you might need to be kind of broad in these time swaths are where I'm going to spend my time. For some of us, you have to be very precise. I love Outlook, and that's the tool that I use for calendar. The last tip I would give you, some of us have got one calendar for home, you got a different calendar for work. Now with technology, when I used to say this was usually a lot of pushback, but now with technology, you could have one calendar for everyone. Whatever, personal life, kids' life, one calendar for everything. In fact, we always have family meetings in my family. Like whenever Justin introduced me, he didn't mention I've got a wife and 5 kids, and my wife homeschools our 5 kids. So we've got a pretty busy family life as well. And I don't look like a crazy person, and nor does my wife, because we use a lot of these same tools at home. So one calendar for everything. So that is the first fundamental, calendar. Second fundamental is a task list. Now, I'm going to tell you what a task list is not, because some of you are guilty of this. This is not a task list. A task list is not, I am so overwhelmed, I get the yellow legal pad out, and then I'm going to write it all out. That's what we did in college. That's binge and purge. In other words, you're so overwhelmed, you actually don't have a task list. You have all these windows open in your mind, and you're just trying to get it out. A task list is some tool that you always have available to you, and the task and projects that you have to work on, there's a repository where you hold those tasks. Now, I've found through a lot of thinking about this that there are about 3 categories of tasks. There's tasks that are 2 minutes or less, and here's a tip. If it's 2 minutes or less, knock it out, get it done. It doesn't need to go anywhere else. Most of those tasks usually come to you via email. You knock those out. You don't put them somewhere else. That's just a waste of your time. The next category are tasks that are about 2 minutes to about 30 minutes. They're a little bit longer than those 2 minutes, and you need some blocks of time to knock those out. That's one reason why I create the blocks throughout the week. And so that's the next category of task. Personally, I really do like Outlook's task tool for those kind of tasks. It's just a quick way when I've got quick windows of time, I'll pop them up and I could knock those tasks out. But then there are tasks that are greater than 30 minutes. And then for a lot of us, not only are the tasks greater than 30 minutes, they have a longer life cycle. And if a task has a longer life cycle, you need some tool where you can work on the task, somewhat tie it up in a bow, and then maybe the next time you have time to work on it again is next week. So it's kind of like a football game of sorts where you move the ball down the field, and you've got to have a way to say, okay, where did I leave that task off? So then the next time I can pick that task back up, I can move the football further down the field. Now, personally, I love OneNote for that, because it's just, if you've never used OneNote before, it's like a legal pad on steroids in electronic space. And you have an infinite number of notebooks, infinite number of tabs, infinite number of sheets, infinite number of space in every sheet. And so I have projects sometimes that in my world go on 1 to 2 years. And if you're like me, sometimes you just get these snippets of time. And so when you're working on it, how do I pick it back up for myself and where I was last week? In fact, some of us, we waste time because we're like, oh God, what was the next thing I needed to do related to that? I don't even worry about that stuff because my tool for the fundamental task is OneNote. So when I can pick it back up, I open up my OneNote, I see where I left it off. What are the next action items? I work on them. And before I close it up, I ask myself, what are the next action steps to move this task forward? So the next time I can pick it back up, it's almost like doing a handoff to my future self. That is the second fundamental, which is called task. All right. Our third fundamental is something that a lot of people have never even thought about. You probably have one, but you never identified it. And by the way, as we go through these fundamentals, I want you to understand the fundamental, but also want you to be thinking about what could be a tool or tools that I might utilize for that fundamental. This is one where a lot of us end up using these things, stickies. In fact, a lot of people think that I hate stickies. And usually I'll brag people a little bit who actually have stickies, only because that's usually a sign of someone that doesn't have a good organization system. And so your intake system, whether you know it or not, sometimes is a sticky. The problem is you've not identified your intake system, you may lose that item. And so intake is kind of what it sounds like. There's stuff coming at you every day. How do you capture that stuff? In fact, before I had an intake system, let's say I was walking down the hall and Brian caught me and said, hey, Comeaux, I need you to work on this. If I didn't have an intake system, I now have an open window in my mind. And then I walked down the hall further and Justin said, hey, Chris, I need you to do this. And I don't have an intake system. Now I have another open window in my mind. Then maybe the third and fourth person, now I've lost one of those things. Now, some of you are wise enough at least to know, I got to write that down somewhere on a sticky. The problem with that is your intake system is your holding tank. And you've got to make sure once a week that your holding tank is cleared out. So personally, I only have 2 intake systems that I use. In fact, I would be willing to bet all of you that you actually have one intake system working right now as we're speaking. It's called your email inbox. Think about it. People are sending stuff into your intake system via your email inbox. The problem with some of us, and this is a different presentation maybe for a different day, is we don't even have a system on how we keep up on our emails. So then you have a lot of stuff sitting in your intake system that people are depending upon you to do something with. So mine is 2 things, my email inbox and my OneNote. I have a tab within OneNote. And then the cool thing about OneNote is you actually can have it on your smartphone. So it doesn't matter if I'm walking down that hall and someone talks to me, my intake system is always with me. I don't have to remember anything, so my conscious mind is able to engage people in conversation. I don't need to be worrying about, oh my God, Justin told me to do this and Brian told me to do that. I could be present because if Brian or Justin asked me to do something, I pop it into my intake system. In fact, quite often I'll send a lot of emails to myself during the day if I'm out and about because it just captures it right into my intake system. So those are tools that I use. Here's what I know. If you've not identified your intake system, you probably got it scattered in a bunch of different places. In fact, back in the old days, I had a recorder with me. I had some little sticky pads. And then I'm like, where did I leave that? Did I record that message to myself that is on a sticky pad? And then I would worry, and then I would compensate by keeping it up in my head. I have found I've become so much more productive and so much more effective when I let my system do that work for me. So that's your intake system. And oh, by the way, another quick tip. So why I love OneNote, you can see a screenshot here, is you can actually click when those things are either done or they're transferred into my task list or on my calendar. So if an item is open, it's still sitting in my intake. And so my intake systems, my OneNote and my email inbox, once a week, I clear those out. And that's my standard for myself. But if something comes in and I didn't anticipate it was a priority, because, you know, we all got crises that come into our organization, I simply put a star next to that item. It's going to be important when we get a little bit further in the presentation, because when we're going to talk about this concept of your big rocks, your most important priorities for the week, the cool thing about knowing your priorities is you don't have to worry about all of that other stuff in your system. You could literally trust your system to be the holding tank for everything else, so you can focus on that which is most important. But during the week, there's some things that come into your intake system that you didn't anticipate. I simply put a yellow star next to those things in my intake. So each week, my biggest priorities are what my plan was, which we'll talk about again under fundamental number 6, and the things in my intake system with a star. It's that simple. Because what you're allowing yourself to do is only focus on that which is most important and trust your system to hold it and not try to hold everything up in your head. So that's the third fundamental. So we know number 1 was calendar, number 2 was task, and number 3 is intake system. Fourth fundamental, so this is usually where some people are usually first 3 going, okay, I'm with you, and I didn't realize it, but I have tools that comply with your fundamentals. But this is one where people go, ooh, I hadn't thought about this one. So the fourth fundamental is the reference system. And your reference system is what do you do with things that aren't actionable today, but you need to find them later. In fact, I never forget, back in the day, John Maxwell used to actually send out, before we had podcasts, used to be these CDs. And it was a great study he cited. And they did a study that the average executive spends 10 years of their life looking for something. Think about that for a second. 10 years. When I read that article, I thought, holy, you know what? What if I repurpose that time and wow, I could actually be more effective. I could, compared to the average person, I'd have 10 more years to do something purposeful in this life. That's where the reference system is important. Having a good system when you need to find something and not spend all this time looking for stuff. So I call that a reference system. Now, to help you get your mind wrapped around it, I've got a couple of examples of tools that I use personally for my reference system. Number 1, I love OneNote. You could tell that from this presentation. And I've got a slide a little bit further about why I love OneNote is because 4 of the fundamentals you could accomplish with that one tool. And so I have a lot of things in OneNote that I don't have to worry about remembering. And the cool thing about OneNote is I could do a quick search function and I can put my hands on something very quickly. So that is one example of a tool of my reference system. Here's another that you probably haven't considered. Your folders in your Outlook inbox or your Gmail inbox. Those folders are a reference system. But if you haven't thought that through strategically, you may spend more time than you should looking for old emails that you need to pull something back up that wasn't actionable, but you need some of that intelligence or situational awareness, whatever it is you're working on. This is my general rule of thumb. I have one folder in my Outlook called All. When I'm done, when it's out of my intake system, and so when you look at my email inbox, generally once a week, my inbox is almost completely clean. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. I drag it out of my inbox and I put it in a folder called All. Now, there's only a few times that I break that rule, because if you actually looked at my email inbox, you would see I do have more than one folder. When we're not consistently talking to each other with the same subject line, then it is a little bit more difficult. Although I have to say this, Microsoft has been on its game lately, really upping its ante on search. So some of this is becoming a little bit more antiquated, and Google is a little bit more powerful in terms of Gmail. But I will create a kind of project folder. So Justin and I, for instance, this presentation, I knew that myself and Fumi and Justin would be emailing each other back and forth in this presentation. And it might take me a little bit to figure out, well, to find that email. But I created one folder, and then after today, I will delete that folder, and I'll drag those emails back into All. So that way you're not sitting there going, wait a minute, what folder does that go into? Your default is pretty much one. And then it's all sitting there, and you have all this great search and filter functionality now in whatever tool you use, where you can put your hands on stuff just very quickly. You're not having to worry about it. It's in your reference system. Now, I'll give you another, oh, I guess I actually deleted it last night. I actually had another one. I have two more that I'll share with you. I have an old school, a brown accordion folder. It's old school because very rarely do I use hard copy stuff anymore. Now even my flight boarding passes, I do on my phone. But like, for instance, our family went to England a couple years ago, and there are a couple of things I wanted hard copy just in case we didn't have cell coverage. Where do you put something like that? I've got a brown accordion folder that has every month of the year, and it has 3 sets of 31. So every day, if there's something I need hard copy, it's just right there. I don't have to worry about where it's at. By the way, some of you on this call, maybe not you, but maybe someone you know, you're so stinking smart. We would probably walk in your office and you got a stack of stuff that big. And someone says, hey, Justin, do you know where this is? And Justin's going to go, oh, yeah, it's right here in the bottom 25% of the stack. what that person doesn't realize is they've actually taken some of their precious bandwidth, their RAM, and they're actually remembering that's where that's at. Why do that? You can use your brain to be a better problem solver and not have to remember it's in the bottom part of the stack. So having a good reference system will save you time, make you more productive and more creative. And so then the last thing that I have in terms of my reference system, so a lot of us read articles, you know, there's so much stuff available. And of course we got Google at our fingertips, but I started filing when I was probably, I guess I'd have been about 20 actually, about 1990. When I would read articles. And the good thing is there used to all be hard copy, but now all of those are electronic. And so I have articles that go all the way back to 1990. In fact, I can remember an article I read on the radio band spectrum in 1991. And I'm not a geek that way, but it was such a great article. And it was just explained into where a common person could understand it. And I still have that article. And in 2 seconds, because I have one folder where all these electronic files exist, and because I could do a quick search functionality on it, I can find that article. And paradoxically, several years ago, it's probably about 5 years ago now, I had to do a presentation on the future of healthcare. And interestingly, they've dedicated a portion of the radio band spectrum to healthcare devices for the future. And so I was able to go back to that article and pull some really critical stuff that helped me prepare that presentation. Think about it. If I didn't have that, how many hours would I burn researching and things like that? So the point of a reference system is you're not burning time. You're able to put your hands on things very quickly and pull it up when you need it. It's not actionable today, but you may need it tomorrow. That's why a reference system is part of your system. Now, the fifth fundamental is actually contacts. And this is actually one of the ones I paid $100 on because I used to not have it as a fundamental. But when the person, actually was a person at Hospice of Acadiana that brought it up, and she said, hey, don't you have contacts as part of your organization system? I'm like, oh, you're right. And so how do you organize when people are giving you a business card? And the great thing is, this is such an easy one to have great tools. I've got an app on my phone. If Justin handed me his business card, I shoot that business card, goes right into my Outlook contact database, it's done. But how many of us don't do that? And maybe Justin wrote his cell phone on the back, and I'm driving and I need to call Justin, and I've done this before in the past, call your wife and say, hey, I need you to go to my office. It's on the bottom drawer and you'll see a business card and it's got the cell phone. So that's a perfect example why having contacts as part of your system is important, and just having a hardwired process where when people are giving you their contact information, you capture it and then you're not having to worry about it. It's in your system. In fact, when you start leading a new team, this is one of the very first things I establish quickly. How do we get in contact with each other? In fact, yeah, I actually did include this. I actually wrote a blog specifically about contacts. It's in the same TCN link that I had a little bit earlier, because there is kind of a sub-component to this, which is how do people get in contact with you? When I usually get a brand new direct report, the first thing I give them is, these are my rules of the road for getting in contact with me. Because if you don't create rules of the road, you got one person texting you, one person calling your cell phone, another person emailing you, and another person instant messaging you. And there is no rhyme or reason by which all of this communication is coming to you. You have no ability to decipher, is this a priority or not a priority? So if you want, check it out. I wrote a blog, just kind of what my personal rules of the road are. You could adopt them for your own, share them with your team. Because if you don't, then what's going to happen is there's not going to be any rhyme or reason by which things are coming at you, and you're going to waste time, or you're going to chase priorities that aren't the real priorities on a day-to-day basis. So that's the fifth fundamental, contacts. All right, this is the sixth fundamental, and I see we got some questions coming in, so we'll get to those in just a little bit here. The sixth fundamental is what I call the daily and weekly review. In fact, if there's one that's more important than the other, I hate to say it that way. I should probably say it this way. This is the one that if you don't do, you're not going to trust anything else in the system. And I learned this from David Allen. He wrote a book called Getting Things Done. And I used to kind of do this, but not as regimented, that I've hardwired in my life since 2006, and it's taken my productivity to a whole nother level. I'm going to use a term that I need to describe to you real quick, which is actually called big rocks. And so Big Rocks is a wonderful little skit that Stephen Covey used to do years ago. Many of you probably have seen it. It's always funny because if we actually did it real time today, I'd have 3 buckets. I'd have some big rocks, I would have some gravel, and I would have some sand. And the challenge to the person that you bring up front is you got to get them all in one container. And if you've never seen it, it's funny because the person invariably tries to take the big rocks and push it down into the sand. And the moral of the story is the way it works is you got to have the big rocks in the container first, then you put the gravel, then you put the sand. It's a beautiful way of illustrating that the most important things have to be identified, and you better work on them first. So we actually have a process in my organization where every week we create our big rocks. That is the product of the daily and weekly review. What's the product of the weekly review? We'll talk about the daily review in a second. So how do you come up with your big rocks each week? This is a really good checklist, and I got an additional slide right afterwards that'll go into a little bit more detail. So the first thing is you got to hardwire when you do it. And so personally, I used to do it on Sunday nights, but I found it was taking time away from my weekends. So I do it on Friday mornings. The key is that you do it sometime before Monday morning at about 10 a.m. Now, people usually go, well, what's up with 10 a.m.? Because, once you get there on a Monday morning and what hits the fan, you're now in the Whitewater Rapids and you want it to go here and your week is taking you in a totally different direction. So personally, mine is done actually before 7 a.m. on Monday morning. I actually send mine out on Sunday night. I work on it Friday morning. And what you're doing is you're kind of processing what happened in your past week and you're developing your battle plan for the coming week. That's your weekly review. And so here's what I'm doing. The first thing is I'm making sure everything is out of my intake system. That's cleaned out. And so my emails, they all get kind of cleaned out once a week. So everything is out of your intake system. And then here's where the vision of the eagle comes into play. You're looking at your calendar and you're looking forward. Now, depending upon how broad of a responsibility you have, the further you have to go out. My sweet spot is 6 weeks out. I literally look over the next 6 weeks. It's like this presentation. This is something I had done in good draft version about 2 weeks ago. And so, cause it comes up on my weekly review. The question for you is, what's your sweet spot? What most leaders do is they just show up on the day. Okay, let me see what I'm supposed to work on. That's not the vision of the eagle. So find what your sweet spot is, look at your calendar, and what you're asking yourself is, based upon what's coming up, what big rocks, what priorities do I need to work on in this coming week? And so what you're doing is determining the big rocks for the next week based upon those priorities. Now, the daily review is basically an abbreviated version of exactly that. So my daily review is really quick. I look at what's on my calendar for the coming day. Is there anything sitting in the intake system that's the core priority right now? Or can it sit in the intake holding tank for the rest of this week? And what's on my big rocks for today that I'm going to focus on? It's an abbreviated version of that. And now I have my battle plan going into the day. Personally, I like to do that before I go to bed because then I can shut it off at night and sleep. And I wake up in the next morning and I'm ready to go. That's my deal. Other people, I have had some people do that and they tell me, but then I process on it all night. Like, then don't do that. Do it first thing the next morning before you kind of hit your day and you get it running. So let's unpack this one a little bit more because this is one that it takes a while to develop the habit. And so practically this is what I do. I actually have a OneNote sheet and I actually have my big rocks for every week of the year. In other words, I have a tab and I actually have a holding tank. So for instance, Justin said, okay, Chris, can you do this webinar? And we generally figured out the timing. So I backed up 2 weeks and I just gave myself a little bit of a tweak and said, hey, you need to be working on this presentation for LAGCOE 2 weeks out. And so it's in a holding tank for my big rocks. So every week when I'm doing my weekly review, I'm looking at what were my big rocks for this past week. I love it when I got all these check boxes. I do think we get that dopamine hit when we check stuff off. I'm a huge proponent of that. And then I look at the holding tank for the big rocks for the current week. And I look at my calendar, as I said, and I clear out my intake system. And what I'm doing is I'm reconciling all of that so I can have my battle plan for the coming week. Now, some of us are very overzealous of what we could accomplish in a week. So there's a skill set, and the reason why I'm giving you a little bit of a warning of that is that if you're overzealous, you're going to get frustrated going, man, I had this big plan and didn't get it to all of it. okay, well, you're probably being too bodacious in what you could accomplish in a week, so be more reasonable. Like, how much of your time can you work on other projects compared to, like, if you're a clinician, if you're a physical therapist seeing patients, or if you're an engineer. And so some of us just have stuff that we work on a day-to-day basis. You'll start to figure out the sweet spot for yourself, and that's going to determine how much stuff you could get done in a week. Now, here's another tip. My organization, we share our big rocks with each other. Why would we do that? Number one, it creates situational awareness of what each other is working on for priorities for that week. Number two, it creates accountability around this. Because if people aren't doing this, if you don't do this weekly review, you're not going to trust everything else in your system. And you're going to start developing these workarounds, and you're going to come back and say, Justin, that Comeaux guy you brought in, that stuff doesn't work. Usually the first place I problem solve with people is, show me your weekly review and show me where you document your big rocks and how do you keep that in front of you on a day-to-day basis. All right, so I created this slide just to give you guys almost like a definition of, okay, so what did you mean by calendar again? So let's just go through this quickly, and I know we want to get to questions. So the calendar is a budget tool for your time. Second fundamental, task list. That's a tool that enables you to eat the elephant one bite at a time. It helps you remember where did you leave off on a project. Think of it like a handoff to your future self. And for those who don't have the luxury of being able to dedicate a full day to a project, and you get those windows of time, you're going to find the need for really good task list tool for yourself. Number three, the intake system. This is a tool that enables you to gather what's coming at you so things don't slip through the cracks. And for a lot of us, you're relying way too much on your memory. You're keeping it up here. And that's a risky proposition considering just how crazy things are these days. Number four, the reference system. These are tools by which you store things in an easily retrievable fashion without having to rely upon your memory. And again, as we go through each of these, there are multiple tools that you can go and get to comply with this. Contacts, these help you organize and store information on people you need to contact. And then remember the sub point, rules of the road for contacting a person. And then daily weekly review, that's the tool that helps you maintain the system and trust it. All right, so just two more slides and I'll stop. What are tools? You've heard me say tools. And the typical presentation on organizing yourself is, hey, let me show you how to use Outlook, or let me show you how to use to-do lists. Those are tools. I find if you teach people the fundamental, you could then master the tool in the best way that works for you. Because usually where people will push back is, oh, that doesn't work for me. And usually what I'll say is, okay, what you're telling me is maybe that tool doesn't work for you, but I can tell you this. If you don't have a tool for the 7 fundamentals, there's a hole in your system and you're not as effective as you could be otherwise. So there are multiple tools out there. Some of you might love Evernote. Some of you might love Google Keep. All of those are tools, but I will promise you this, there's 7 fundamentals. If you find more, I'll gladly pay you $100. And then last slide, why I love OneNote is because it actually accomplishes 4 of the fundamentals for me. I use it for my intake system, my reference system, my daily and weekly review, and my task list. And it's also mobile-based. So not only do I have it on my laptop, I've got it on my smartphone. If you love Evernote, I get it. Evernote is similar. You could have it on your desktop. You could have it on your smartphone. I'm not a reseller of any of these products. I just know this is a tool that's really effective. So with that, I think we're going to stop and we're going to take some questions. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one more thing. This is more theoretical, but it's something I want you to think about in the context of your time. Stephen Covey taught this years ago. This is an oldie, but it's still very relevant. Covey said this, that you can plot where you spend your time in 4 quadrants. So our y-axis on the left side there is important and not important. And the x-axis is urgent and not urgent. And Covey said this, effective people spend their time in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. Very effective people realize that they have to steal time from quadrant 1 on quadrant 2. And the analogy he would use is, if you feel like your day-to-day is fighting fires or fighting alligators, if you don't put out the cause of the fires or drain the swamp, you will always be in quadrant 1. And what I've found is a really effective getting things done system, an organization system, will allow you to do that. And that while today, let's say, you know what, you're not a person that spends time in quadrant 3 and 4, I hope you're not, because that basically means you have lots of time wasters in your life. But you might say, Comeaux, I'm in so many crises. That's quadrant 1. What I find is the getting things done system empowers you to start pushing against those whitewater rapids and carve out some time to work on quadrant 2, to get rid of the crises, to get rid of the alligators. And then you start to balance it out and you become more and more effective, and you become a leader who creates the future and not just reacts to stuff. So with that, Justin, we're going to stop and we're going to take some questions from people.
Okay, so we have some good questions. First one is, what app do you use for your business card to Outlook transfer?
It's called CamCard.
Okay.
So CAM, CamCard.
What are your best practices for dealing with email rules of the road for an entire organization? For example, getting requests that don't belong to you, emails with no action items, or expectations for responses, timeframes.
Yeah, that's a really good one, Justin. And that would be a whole nother hour, but we do have rules of the road. I don't think we actually have that blog on the website anymore. Maybe that could be our future one, but suffice to say, if you don't create rules of the road in your organization, there's not going to be any rhyme or reason for emails by which you get into your organization. So number one is you got to create some rules of the road. We've got our own rules. I could teach it to you. Number two is it comes down to this concept of need to know communication. And it's a whole principle. And need to know is that we understand each other's roles in the organization. In fact, always a great metaphor. I wasn't a very good baseball player. You guys in Louisiana, we have so many great baseball players. But if you watch a baseball game and how baseball players are talking to each other in the field, they're not talking smack. They're telling each other what do they need to know to play the game right now. So if you use that as a metaphor in your organization, a lot of organizational chatter, emails, it's just ineffective. It's not need to know. And so getting that part of the lexicon, which is basically the vocabulary of your organization, is important, that we actually start to use this concept of need to know and people know what that means. And one of the kind of core principles to understand need to know is we have to understand each other's role. You know, the right fielder is not talking to the catcher. The right fielder is probably actually talking to some of the earlier basemen of the shortstop based upon what's about ready to happen. But in organizations, we don't think that way. And we just have all this inefficient and ineffective communication, and it costs money and it takes away. And we're like, gosh, we don't have time to get to the important stuff. It's because we have ineffective communication. And email is a huge time suck in a lot of organizations. You got all these people in the two line and the CC line, and they're all responding. And it's like a bad virus. It's like COVID. It just keeps spreading to each other, exponentially. So that's a whole nother presentation, but I'll tell you, that is a time worth spending where you would get a really good return on investment, defining those rules of the road and starting to create a lexicon around what is need to know in our organization.
Okay, next one is, how do you handle if you overschedule yourself this week and aren't able to finish all tasks and it bleeds into the following week? How to avoid snowballing?
Yeah, so one tip that I do personally that I hardwire, and realize not everybody has an executive assistant, but once a month, I actually go over my calendar for the next 2 months. So we try to reconcile potential conflicts earlier on. And then when I do my weekly review, so I've got 2 kind of quality passes to try to eliminate a lot of that overbooking. And so I find I really head off a lot of things at the pass that way. But the other thing is to realize I'm kind of okay that about 15 to 20% of my stuff carries over. I'm kind of wired that way. If some of you start to take that as like some aspect of defeat, then start to figure out what is that right kind of bolus of tasks that you can get done. And it takes about a good 3 to 6 weeks to figure out that rhythm for yourself. So one, I would say, create a process where you're looking at your calendar ahead of time, try to make sure you get rid of those conflicts, then have your plan for your big rocks, and figure out what works for you. For me, I'm cool carrying over 15 to 20%. I find I'm super efficient. I never have a moment going, what am I going to do here? I know what to do with my time, but also there's a flip side to this, and Brian will give me a shout out on this one. Taking care of yourself is important too. So time to create, whatever it is, prayer, meditation, centering yourself, that's an important thing as well. So this is not about squeezing every inch of the day where you feel like this wrung out towel. There's a whole nother aspect to In fact, I wrote a blog, surprise, called Rhythms of Life, where I speak a little bit of that. So that's also on our TCM website.
Yeah, I can agree to that, Chris. Taking time for yourself is a huge part of your health. And it goes to help you to be more effective in the long run. Next question is, as a subpart to the task list, how do you follow up on tasks completed on your end, but pending a response from another party, or roadblocks to completing tasks until completion, or how do you handle, or what tool do you use for follow-ups?
Wow, there's a lot packed into that one. So the easy answer is, personally, this is where I like Outlook tasks, because you actually can delegate it out to other people, and you have the quick drag and drop function. If you guys know what I'm talking about, in Outlook, you could drag an email right into a task, and you could assign it to someone. So I use Outlook quite a bit for tasks that other people are working on, but I also do a little bit in OneNote as well. And so those are the two tools that I personally use. Now, at an organizational level, when you have multiple project codependencies, that's a whole nother conversation. But suffice to say, we use a lot of Excel, and we're really good about figuring out who is responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. If you never heard that before, that's called the RACI chart. It's just, if we have an Excel spreadsheet of who's working on task, we ask ourselves that for each task. And we live in that quite a bit as an organization, but that's a whole nother presentation.
That's something that you share with other organizations as well, if you're working with another organization?
Yeah, that's actually one of the core tools that we teach, Justin, with all the hospices we work with. Because like every organization, right, if it's almost like a getting things done system at an organizational level, we call it the operational plan. And so we make sure every program we work with has an operational plan that has those accountabilities. And then people at an individual level take those things that they're either accountable or responsible for, and they put it in their own getting things done system.
So, another question is, how do you handle multiple email accounts attached to multiple calendars and contact lists?
That's a good one. I'm not a huge tech guru there, but I know I have all of my email accounts pouring all into my one Outlook. So you could have multiple accounts set up that way. Some of you might be really high-techy and can come up with some reasons why it doesn't work. I know it works for me. Outlook is my go-to, and I've got a couple of email accounts, and they're all plugged right into the same thing. There are smart people out there that can help you work through that. When we used to have this conversation just 5 years ago, now most of those barriers have been removed. So there's a way for it to happen.
Okay. So we had one more. It was kind of similar. It says many are working remotely. You mentioned maintaining one calendar. Should we carry that over to the household calendar to help create work-life balance for the entire family?
Yeah, one quick comment, and my old boss, Quint Studer, taught me this. The lexicon of work-life balance is a misnomer. You're always set up to fail. You're always, think about, balance brings these scales of justice in your head. And if you have to stay home with your kids today because they're sick, now you've just lost on work. And then tomorrow, now you work more, now you've lost on family. I love the concept of work-life blend. It's a much better framing. And now with what's happened with COVID, with so many of us virtual, thinking of it that way is a much better way. And work-life blend doesn't mean, well, now because I work from home, I work from 7 in the morning till midnight. That's not work-life blend. But figuring out how do you blend the two in your life, I think that's a much better framing. And personally, we're able through, all of us have iPhones as a family, and I use Outlook. Our calendar is superimposed, so I get to see our family on top of my Outlook calendar.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thank you for this presentation. I took a lot of notes, so I'm definitely walking away with stuff. I hope everyone else did as well. And also thanks to MTS Physical Therapy and Wellness for making this webinar possible. Everyone, if you like today's presentation, we encourage you to become a member of YPL because we're going to have more of these planned for 2020, including a 2020 Energy Leadership Program. So stay tuned to LAGCOE social media for updates on the program and also for the celebration of National Petroleum